Hello, I'm Julian Whittle from Cumbria Chamber of Commerce, and I'm here with Pauline Jackson, a tax partner with the chartered accountant Saint & Co, and we're going to talk about VAT. Pauline, the VAT threshold, it's currently £85,000, which means all businesses with annual sales above this must register for VAT and charge VAT on their goods and services. You could say they're functioning as unpaid tax collectors. Now, normally the threshold rises along with inflation, but in the autumn budget, the Chancellor said the threshold was going to stay at 85,000 until 2020, pending the outcome of a consultation. The Treasury has now launched a call for evidence. So why is the government considering changing the VAT threshold?
Well, if you actually read through the consultation document that the government have just issued, this call for evidence, they're putting a very positive spin on what they're looking for. They think that small businesses are holding back from expansion, and specifically so that they don't have to specifically so that they don't have to deal with VAT.
Yeah.
However, if you read between the lines on this document, I actually think that what they're looking at is a lot of lost revenue. That's the bottom line of it, although obviously they're putting this positive spin on it. There's 5.7 million businesses in the UK, out of which only 2.2 are registered for VAT. So another 3.5 million businesses there that could potentially be paying VAT over into the Exchequer.
I think that adds up potentially to tax revenue of 2.1 billion a year if everybody was VAT registered.
Yeah, it's a lot of lost revenue at the minute that the revenue don't have.
Yeah. So how does the UK VAT threshold compare with other EU and OECD countries?
Well, I was actually quite surprised when I read the document to realise that the £85,000 limit that we have in the UK is actually the highest out there in the UK, out of the EU and OECD countries. Spain and the Netherlands don't have any limit. There's zero threshold, which is very surprising. Yeah. And the average overall for all countries in the EU and OECD is about 29,000. So that's very low compared to what we've got. Yeah.
So are there benefits to having a high threshold?
Oh yes, absolutely, because from a business perspective, it means that they haven't got so much compliance, they don't have so much paperwork to deal with, and that can save businesses time and money. And VAT itself is a very complex area anyway, so unfortunately, it is quite easy to get VAT wrong, and if you do, then that can take a lot of time and effort and money to put things right. So from a business perspective, it is much easier if they can actually stay outside of the VAT. And
it's true, isn't it, as well, that when businesses do pass the threshold and they have to register, they then have a dilemma if they're in the business to consumer market as opposed to businesses to businesses where it's not so much an issue. But in the B2C market, they've then got a dilemma. Do they pass on the VAT by raising their prices, or do they absorb it? And I've seen some things, I think a third raise their prices to reflect the fact that they're charging VAT, but 2/3 actually absorb the hit and see their profits squeezed. So what are the arguments for lowering the threshold?
One of the reasons would be the government reckon is to try to reduce the distortions that come in from competition. So, as you say, where a business has to charge VAT on, a lot of cases pass it on to the consumer, whereas if they're competing against businesses who are not VAT registered, their prices are so much cheaper, and so consumers, if they've got a choice, will probably go to the non-VAT registered business. Also, you might find that businesses will deliberately limit the turnover so that they don't come within these the VAT threshold, and so we get sort of this, like what they're calling a cliff edge nature, which is quite difficult to say, and the government reckon that this can actually have impact on decisions with regards to investment and upskilling and innovation, because businesses stay stuck at that £85,000 limit of sales.
And there's an argument as well, isn't there, that it encourages businesses to operate in the black economy because by operating cash in hand and not declaring it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Now, the Treasury has commissioned some research from Ipsos Mori. It's an opinion poll company we normally hear from at election times, but they asked them to research how businesses manage to keep their turnover under the threshold. What sort of practices did they come across?
Well, we've got the illegal ones that you've touched on already with regards to not reporting cash. However, there are legal ways that a lot of businesses will operate, and I have seen this in practice. You could take as an example business in the holiday sector, perhaps tourism or leisure industry, who maybe have good income through the summer and may actually close the business for a month or two over Christmas or the winter period when there's not so many people around, to intentionally retain their income below the 85,000 threshold.
Yeah.
Other businesses may actually decline to do work, so you get small one-man bands who may actually say, well, I'm coming up to the 85,000 limit. I'm not going to take on this particular job. And so by actually declining work, you would hope the work will pass on to somebody else, but in their instance, they're keeping below the threshold. Well,
I'll come back in the next tax year and I'll see you then.
Yes, yeah.
So, serious point here. Do you think that in trying to avoid VAT registration, some businesses are actually limiting their growth potential?
Oh, absolutely. And I think the research that Maury were looking into shows that there's definitely a decline in some of the growth of businesses up to the VAT threshold. But then once they've actually taken that big step and gone over the threshold, that growth seems to increase again within the businesses. Yeah. So it definitely is a stopping point for some businesses as to whether or not they're going to cross that barrier in effect.
Now, some unregistered businesses are worried that if they do register for VAT, it's going to involve them in lots of time-consuming paperwork. But there are simplification measures available to SMEs, aren't there? Oh,
yes. There's three main schemes that the government have implemented over the last few years, which can help SMEs. Not all of the schemes would be suitable for all businesses, and some of the criteria may not be met by different businesses. So you have to look at each particular one. But the idea behind all of them is to make VAT recording and VAT registration and record keeping easier. So the first and the biggest scheme out there is the flat rate scheme, which is available to businesses who have a turnover of less than 150,000, and it allows businesses to use what we call a fixed flat rate. So dependent upon the type of business that you're in, the rate would reflect what a typical proportion of the VAT would be if you operated a full VAT scheme. The flat rate scheme is used by about 360,000 businesses at the minute, so it is quite popular. However, again, it does have some funny little idiosyncrasies which you need to be aware of and can catch people out. Another scheme is the annual accounting scheme. Now, this is available to much larger businesses, so up to 1.35 million of turnover.
Yeah.
Businesses only need to require to submit a VAT return once a year. So again, this is going to make the administration a lot easier. And rather than pay quarterly VAT, they then pay it monthly, and then in effect you have like a balancing payment to make up. So that suits a lot of clients. But that's only used by about 17,000 businesses. So out of all the millions of businesses in the UK, we're looking at very small figures here. And the third option for making your VAT a little bit easier is to look at the cash accounting scheme. So this would suit businesses who maybe aren't paid for quite a long time on their invoicing. So rather than using the usual invoice system for VAT, they pay the VAT over as and when they receive the cash or they make cash payments. Again, this is available on businesses up to 1.35 million, but again, it's not a very high take-up on this in comparison to the flat rate scheme.
I've just wondered as well, we've got Making Tax Digital on the horizon, haven't we, next year?
Yes,
Will that make reporting VAT easier?
In some ways it should do, where businesses now hopefully will become more IT savvy, and so they'll be able to scan invoices, and they will have software that will read invoices, read bank statements. So in theory, once you've got a suitable system in place, doing your VAT return should actually be a lot easier.
Okay. Now, you used that phrase cliff edge a little while ago, and at present, that VAT registration is a cliff edge. You're either VAT registered or you're not. But the Office of Tax Simplification has suggested two options to smooth the transition from non-registration to full registration. How would they work?
There's two different areas of what they're calling smoothing that's available. One is to look at the administrative side of things, and the second is to look at the financial side. So from an administrative perspective, what they're looking to think about is to allow businesses who exceed the VAT liability, rather than having to do the first return within 3 months and make the payment over, is to let them do that over a 6-month period.
Yeah.
So it's a bit more, giving them a bit more time to deal with the VAT return. And then they're also considering looking at, rather than your £85,000 threshold for 1 year, is looking at it over a 2-year period. So you've got 170,000, and that will maybe give a little bit more flexibility to businesses who have peaks and troughs, and will allow them to then look at it over a 2-year period, which actually is probably quite sensible, because quite often if a business does exceed the limit, you have to register, but then you have to request to be able to be taken back out of VAT if you expect to be
drops.
So it's just a bit of a cumbersome system, so that actually would probably help a lot of businesses. The second option is what we're calling financial smoothing, and so that's in effect giving some sort of discount when the business first comes into liability for VAT. So we've sort of got an example of this already under the flat rate scheme, where a new business registering for VAT and going straight into the flat rate scheme gets an automatic 1% deduction in the first year. So it's something along those lines that they're looking at, and maybe even increasing the 1% for the flat rate scheme up to a higher figure, and then gradually people will come back into the full rate of VAT.
Okay. Now, of course, businesses with a turnover below 85,000 a year can voluntarily register for VAT, even though they don't have to. And about 1 million, I think, do this. So what circumstances would you advise a business to register voluntarily?
It would mainly be a business who would be looking to reclaim input VAT on goods and services that they've purchased from other businesses, which they maybe wouldn't be able to claim back if they didn't voluntarily register. Other reasons, sometimes businesses will register for VAT to make them in effect appear a larger business, especially if they're new businesses and they're looking for credit, or they're looking to appeal to lenders or investors. Once businesses see that you're VAT registered, they will actually probably automatically assume that you have a turnover in excess of 85,000, but obviously this isn't always the case.
No.
So there are different reasons, and quite a lot of businesses, as you say, actually do voluntarily register.
And I suppose if your customers are all VAT registered anyway, it's the fact that you're charging VAT is no problem, because they reclaim it.
Yes,
and if you're paying for VAT at the moment, you're paying VAT on all your supplies, you'll be able to reclaim that VAT once you're registered.
Right,
so
brilliant.
you can see it would make sense.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're almost there, Pauline. Thank you very much. Just to wrap up, businesses can respond to the Treasury's call for evidence by completing an online questionnaire. It should take around 7 minutes. You can find the link on our Chamber Insight website, and the deadline for completing the survey is June the 5th. That's great. Thank you, Pauline.
Thank you, Julian.